If this message has reached you, take it as something precise rather than random. Not coincidence, not an accident of timing, not a meaningless overlap of patterns or algorithms. It is showing up because something in you was already asking for it, long before you ever formed the question in words. Somewhere beneath your thoughts, in the quiet parts of you that you don't usually share with anyone, you have been carrying a feeling, a question that never fully left. You may not have spoken it out loud, but it has been there, in the background of everything you feel. Wondering if what you experienced was real. Wondering if it still matters. Wondering if it had depth, or if it was only something your emotions created because you felt too much, too deeply, too honestly. That question didn't disappear just because you tried to ignore it. Even when you told yourself to move on, even when you tried to accept silence as an answer, something inside you remained aware that the story didn't feel fully finished. And now, at this exact point in your inner timing, this reaches you. Not early, not late, right in the space where uncertainty and acceptance are still fighting for control. The place where your heart is tired, but not closed, where letting go and holding on are both still possible, and neither feels completely final. What you are reading is not meant to confuse you or push you in any direction. It is meant to steady something inside you that has been shaken for a while. To remind you that what you felt was not empty, that your inner experience was not meaningless just because it was not fully understood or returned in the way you expected. You have been quiet about it for a long time, acting as if the chapter ended, convincing yourself that you already made peace with it, moving forward on the surface while something deeper in you stayed connected to the same emotional thread. And that is why, even in silence, it still returns to you, in thoughts, in memories, in moments when everything around you becomes still. There is a part of you that never fully agreed with the idea that it was over. But this is not something that resolves through pressure or forced logic. It does not respond to overthinking or emotional urgency. It unfolds in its own rhythm, in alignment, in timing that you cannot fully control or predict. And now, you are being brought back into awareness of it in a way that feels impossible to ignore. It is important that you release one belief first, that your feelings are an exaggeration. They are not. You are not creating depth where there is none. You are not imagining significance just because you wanted something to matter. What you felt had weight because it came from something real inside you. And what is real inside you does not disappear just because circumstances are unclear. You do not experience connection this strongly without reason. You do not hold on internally to something that carries no meaning for your system, your memory, your emotional truth. And the bond you feel was never built only on surface attraction or temporary emotion. It felt deeper because it reached deeper layers of you. That is why it did not fully leave you. There is something within you that still reacts to this connection, even in silence. That reaction is not confusion. It is not weakness. It is recognition. And what you are sensing now is not about forcing a conclusion. It is about becoming aware that your experience is still active inside you, even if nothing is being expressed outwardly. You may have convinced yourself that distance means loss, that silence means absence, that not seeing something means it no longer exists in the same way. But distance is not always what it appears to be. What feels like separation on the surface does not necessarily define what exists on a deeper emotional or energetic level between two people. Sometimes absence only changes the form of connection, not the existence of it. There are bonds that do not rely on constant contact to remain present in awareness. They continue quietly, even when communication stops, even when behavior changes, even when people act like they are no longer affected. And in those moments, both sides can experience things they do not openly explain. Thoughts that arrive unexpectedly, memories that surface without warning, emotions that do not fully align with what they show to the outside world. Not everything that is felt is expressed, and not everything that is hidden is gone. You may not see what is happening beyond the surface, but that does not mean nothing is happening. What is genuine does not always stay visible. Sometimes it goes inward instead of outward. And this is where your awareness becomes important. Because what you are being asked to understand is not about forcing certainty, but about not dismissing your inner sense completely. There is a reason this connection still lives in your awareness. There is a reason your thoughts return here even when you try to move away from it. There is a reason your emotional system still responds when you think of them. It is not random repetition, it is continuity. Still, this is not something that should push you into anxiety or obsession. It is not meant to trap you in waiting or expectation. It is meant to bring you back into balance with your own perception. Stop interpreting silence as proof that nothing exists. Stop assuming distance automatically means emotional disappearance. Because what is happening internally between two people is not always visible externally. And your inner knowing has been trying to tell you that for a while. That quiet feeling you get when you think of them, the one you sometimes question, that is not something to dismiss too quickly. It is part of your emotional intelligence, not an illusion. At the same time, you are not meant to chase uncertainty. You are not meant to lose yourself in interpretation. You are meant to stay grounded while still acknowledging what you feel. Because what is meant for you does not need forcing. And what has genuine depth does not require you to convince yourself of its existence every day. You may feel at times that you are the one holding more of the emotional weight, that you are the one remembering more, that you are the one who still feels something stronger. But perception is often incomplete when you are only seeing one side of a story. People do not always express what they feel in ways that are easy to recognize. Some withdraw when they feel too much. Some become silent when they are overwhelmed. Some distance themselves not because they feel nothing, but because they do not know how to handle what they feel. So, what you observe externally is not always the full emotional truth. There is more beneath it than you are currently able to see. And the deeper message in all of this is not to rush toward conclusions, but to stop denying your own internal experience just because external clarity has not arrived yet. What you feel is not something you randomly created. It is something that formed through experience, memory, and emotional imprint. And imprints do not disappear simply because time becomes unclear. There are connections that remain present in awareness long after physical distance appears. And when something continues to return to your thoughts without effort, it is not always something you are meant to erase. Sometimes it is something you are meant to understand differently. Not as obsession, not as dependence, but as awareness that something has not fully closed within you yet. So instead of forcing yourself to forget, or forcing yourself to decide too early what it all means, allow yourself to simply notice what is real in your experience without judgment. Because even in silence, something inside you is still responding. And that response is telling you something important. This is not the end of what you felt. It is the beginning of understanding why it stayed. How this connection shows itself in your reality is not through loud events or obvious signs, but through subtle internal shifts that feel like they arrive from nowhere and yet feel strangely familiar. The first way it often appears is as emotional resonance. You notice changes in your mood that don't fully match your surroundings. A sudden heaviness, a wave of calm, or an unexplained restlessness can move through you without a clear reason. It feels as if something external is brushing against your inner state, even though nothing in your immediate environment has changed. This experience is often interpreted as confusion or overthinking, but in your inner world, it feels different. It feels like something is moving, something unspoken that doesn't have a visible source. In moments like this, your mind tries to find logic, but your emotional system reacts first. That reaction is what makes it feel so real and difficult to dismiss. Another way this connection shows itself is through sudden emotional echoes. You might be going through a normal day when an unexpected wave of sadness, nostalgia, or longing appears. There is no direct trigger you can point to. Nothing has happened in that moment to justify it. Yet the feeling is strong enough to slow your thoughts for a second, as if your inner world has briefly shifted into another frequency. This is often the mind's attempt to assign meaning to something the heart is already processing beneath awareness. You may label it as stress, tiredness, or random mood change, but emotionally it feels more specific than that. It feels like a memory without a picture, a presence without form. Then there are the mental intrusions that feel too precise to ignore. You may be fully focused on something else or completely relaxed when their image, voice, or memory suddenly surfaces in your awareness. It doesn't feel like a deliberate thought you created. It feels like it arrived on its own. What makes it powerful is not just the memory itself, but the emotional charge attached to it. For a brief moment, your attention is pulled out of the present and into something that feels emotionally unresolved. At times, this also connects with physical sensations that seem to carry emotional meaning. A warmth in the chest, a tightening feeling, or a sudden emptiness in the stomach can appear without an obvious physical cause. These sensations are usually brief, but noticeable enough that you pause and try to understand them. The mind searches for explanations, yet none feel fully satisfying. Music and sound often become another trigger point. A random song may play that feels connected to a past emotional moment, or a melody may carry an emotional tone that reminds you of them without a clear reason. It doesn't have to be a shared song. Sometimes it is simply the mood of the sound that activates memory and feeling at the same time. It creates a bridge between present awareness and past emotional imprint. You might also notice that your intuition becomes more active in this period. You feel like you just know something is still present, even when there is no physical confirmation. This knowing is not based on external evidence, but on internal continuity. It is the feeling that something has not fully resolved within you, so it continues to surface in different forms. But what is important to understand is that these experiences, while deeply real in how they feel, do not necessarily point to a shared external energetic exchange or guaranteed mirrored emotions in another person. The human mind is highly sensitive to attachment, memory, and emotional imprint. When someone has had a strong emotional impact on you, your brain continues to simulate their presence through thoughts, sensations, and associations long after actual interaction has reduced. Uncertainty itself also plays a major role. When there is no closure, the mind tends to keep the emotional loop active. It revisits memories, replays meanings, and searches for patterns that can explain the unresolved feeling. This is why silence or distance can feel so loaded internally. It gives your mind space to keep interpreting rather than concluding. From a psychological perspective, what feels like signals is often the interaction between memory, attachment, and emotional expectation. The brain connects unrelated stimuli, songs, moods, physical sensations, to a central emotional focus point. Over time, this creates the experience of meaning being everywhere, even when the external situation remains unchanged. So what you are really experiencing in these moments is not a direct external transmission, but a strong internal echo of emotional significance. It is your own system trying to organize something that still feels unfinished within you. And that is why it feels persistent. Not because something is constantly being sent toward you, but because something inside you has not yet reached resolution. The way this dynamic is described often frames silence as something almost mystical. But what you are actually dealing with here is a very human emotional pattern shaped by fear, attachment style, and unresolved internal conflict. When someone pulls away from a bond that feels intense, it is usually not because the connection is unreal, but because the intensity activates their threat system. In psychology, this is often linked to avoidant coping mechanisms, where closeness starts to feel overwhelming, even if the person genuinely cares. So instead of moving toward connection, they create distance to regain emotional control. That inner conflict can feel like two opposing forces. One part of them is drawn to closeness, familiarity, and emotional comfort. The other part reacts to vulnerability with caution, telling them to step back before they feel too exposed or dependent. What looks like silence from the outside is often this internal push and pull being acted out in behavior. It's important to ground this in reality. Silence does not function as proof of hidden communication, energetic struggle, or external destiny-driven interaction. It is usually just absence of contact, shaped by avoidance, uncertainty, or lack of emotional readiness. The mind, however, especially when emotionally invested, tends to fill that silence with meaning because uncertainty is uncomfortable to sit with. This is where the experience becomes psychologically powerful. When there is no clarity, the brain naturally starts building narratives to explain the emotional tension. Memories feel sharper, patterns feel meaningful, random thoughts feel connected. This is not because external forces are transmitting signals, but because your attachment system is actively trying to resolve unfinished emotional information. From their side, withdrawal is often less dramatic than it feels from the inside of the experience. It can come from overwhelm, emotional immaturity, fear of commitment, or simply not knowing how to process intensity in a healthy way. That does not necessarily mean indifference, but it also does not automatically imply hidden longing or ongoing emotional conflict of the kind being imagined in spiritual terms. On your side, the experience of learning and growth during separation is real, but it is happening internally within you, not as a coordinated transformation designed by external destiny. You are adapting emotionally to uncertainty. You are learning self-regulation in the absence of clarity. You are building tolerance for emotional ambiguity. That is a real psychological process, but it is not evidence of a synchronized spiritual plan between two people. One of the most important turning points in understanding this is realizing that obsession with meaning often comes from lack of closure, not from depth of connection. When something remains unresolved, the mind keeps it active. It replays, reinterprets, and assigns significance to anything that can reduce uncertainty. The healthiest shift is not toward stronger faith in the bond, but toward clearer grounding in what is actually observable: communication, actions, consistency, and mutual engagement. Without those, everything else remains interpretation, not confirmation. Trust in relationships is not built through internal conviction alone. It is built through repeated, mutual behavior over time. And when that is missing, the mind tends to replace it with narratives that feel emotionally satisfying, but are not necessarily anchored in shared reality. So what this silence is showing you is not a hidden energetic process, but your own emotional system responding to ambiguity. And the most stabilizing step forward is not trying to decode it further, but gradually returning your attention to what is real, present, and verifiable in your life right now. So what this silence is showing you is not a hidden energetic process, but your own emotional system responding to ambiguity. And the most stabilizing step forward is not trying to decode it further, but gradually returning your attention to what is real, present, and verifiable in your life right now. Because when something feels unfinished, the mind has a tendency to treat it like a puzzle that must eventually have a secret answer. It keeps scanning for meaning, replaying moments, reading into timing, and attaching significance to coincidences. But not every emotional experience is meant to be decoded like a message. Some experiences are simply meant to be felt, processed, and then released when they are no longer reciprocal in reality. The human brain is not designed to handle prolonged uncertainty in emotional bonds very well. It naturally tries to reduce discomfort by creating stories that feel coherent. That is why distance can start to feel charged, why silence can feel meaningful, and why absence can feel like presence in disguise. It is not because something external is actively communicating with you, but because your mind is still emotionally invested in resolving something that has no clear ending. And when clarity does not come from the other person, the mind begins generating its own form of clarity. It turns feelings into patterns. It turns memories into signs. It turns emotional residue into perceived signals. This is not a flaw in you. It is simply how attachment works when it is interrupted without closure. But understanding this clearly is where emotional freedom begins. Because once you see that meaning is being constructed internally rather than delivered externally, you can begin to step back from the loop of interpretation. You can start separating what is felt from what is actually happening. And that separation is crucial, because without it, emotion alone starts to shape your entire perception of reality. At the same time, it is also important not to dismiss your feelings or invalidate what you experienced. Something can matter to you emotionally without needing to be explained through destiny, energy, or hidden communication. Real emotional impact does not require a mystical explanation to be valid. It simply means you were affected deeply, and your mind is still processing that impact. There is also a deeper layer here that is often overlooked. When people are emotionally uncertain, they tend to focus intensely on the other person's internal world, what they might be feeling, thinking, or hiding. This focus creates the illusion that understanding the other person will bring relief. But in reality, the only thing that brings relief is clarity in behavior, not speculation about intention. You cannot regulate your emotional stability through guessing someone else's inner state. That path always leads to exhaustion because it has no final answer. The only sustainable grounding point is what is consistently shown, not what is assumed beneath the surface. This is why emotional detachment is not about forcing yourself to stop caring. It is about stopping the search for certainty in places where certainty is not being offered. It is about bringing your attention back from interpretation and into observation. What is actually happening? What is actually being communicated? What is actually present in my reality today? These questions anchor you back into stability. Over time, something important begins to shift. The emotional intensity does not necessarily disappear overnight, but its control over you weakens. The thoughts still arise, but they carry less authority. The memories still appear, but they no longer dictate your emotional state as strongly. The silence remains silence, but it stops feeling like a message. And in that space, you begin to reclaim your own mental clarity. You also begin to rediscover something that often gets lost in deep emotional fixation. Your own life outside of the connection. Your routines, your goals, your interests, your growth, your conversations, your direction. These things do not stop existing just because one emotional thread became intense. In fact, they are what restore balance when that thread becomes overwhelming. Because your emotional world is not meant to revolve around one unanswered story. It is meant to be wide enough to hold many experiences, many connections, and many forms of meaning that are actually reciprocal and present. And slowly, when attention returns to your own reality, something very natural happens. The emotional charge of the uncertainty begins to dissolve. Not because you forced it away, but because you stopped feeding it constant interpretation. What once felt like a constant signal becomes quieter simply because it is no longer being reinforced internally. This is the point where healing becomes real, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. You start realizing that peace does not come from finally understanding the other person. It comes from no longer needing to. And that is a powerful shift. Because at that stage, your emotional center is no longer dependent on absence or presence, clarity or confusion. It begins to stabilize within yourself. You stop waiting for meaning to be revealed and start living in what is already known. And what is known is this. You are allowed to move forward without having every answer. You are allowed to let something be unfinished and still continue your life fully. You are allowed to care about something without being emotionally controlled by it. That is not indifference. That is maturity of emotional perception. And as this perspective settles in, something else becomes clear as well. If a connection is meant to be mutual in a real, grounded way, it does not require endless interpretation to survive. It expresses itself through action, communication, and presence. Not through silence that must be decoded, but through consistency that can be seen. So you are not being asked to stop feeling. You are being asked to stop over-interpreting. Feelings can exist without becoming a narrative. Memories can exist without becoming signs. And silence can exist without becoming a hidden language. When you reach that understanding, the emotional weight begins to shift. Not suddenly, but steadily. The urgency fades. The searching slows down. The internal noise becomes softer. And what remains is a calmer awareness of what actually is, instead of what might secretly be. And in that calm space, you are no longer pulled outward into endless analysis. You come back inward into yourself. That is where real emotional balance begins. Not in answers from someone else, but in the quiet return to your own stability, clarity, and direction. And from there, you are finally able to see the situation for what it is, without distortion, without projection, and without the need to turn uncertainty into meaning. Just reality, as it is, and yourself as you are. And that is enough to move forward.